I'm pretty in touch with what robust ROI financial justifications look like. Honestly, just because of the diversity of use cases within language services, I actually think the ROI for localization spend is really complicated.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Slator Pod. Today on the podcast is Paul Carr. Paul is the CEO of We Localize, language solutions integrator in our terminology, and super agency, We Localize. Hi Paul, thanks so much for joining.
Thank you so much, Florian.
Where are you recording this from today?
Orange County, so somewhere in between Los Angeles and San Diego.
Yeah, different location for me as well. For those of you who watch on YouTube, we're up in the mountains here on the Easter weekend. So, all right, Paul, let's do a bit of intro first. You did a lot of things prior to We Localize, prior to becoming We Localize CEO in consulting, financial services. I saw that you also were in a role with Williams Lee. It was one of my key competitors in my LSI days back in Hong Kong, competed with them. They were also a client, so client/competitor. So tell me a bit more about the career prior to We Localize, and then, how this all got started with We Localize.
Basically started my career in strategy. So I was a partner at the Boston Consulting Group, which is a consulting shop. I ran strategy for a period of time at American Express. And then I sort of switched to general management. So I've been, running businesses for the last 15 or 20 years, and those have been primarily private equity backed. So the first one was actually in the legal vertical. It was the largest alternate legal service provider. The next one, the one right prior to We Localize, was in a data business, actually, in institutional investment research. The Williams Lee experience, I was on the board of Williams Lee, actually, so through a pretty material transformation that Advent, who were the sponsor at the time, were driving. And so then that brings us up to 2023, early part of 2023, when I joined We Localize, and so I'm sort of 3 years in, and so I'm a relatively new to the language industry. I mean, I've been on the buy side, so I have procured language services, but I'd never worked within the industry, and so I was drawn to basically the international nature. I'm as you can tell, I'm not American. I'm living in America. I'm Australian, but have lived all over the place. I was drawn to the kind of international nature of the industry, as well as the fact that it's in the middle of a very interesting period of kind of disruption, which I'm kind of drawn to. So 3 years into the journey.
Yeah, that's a great time to join. 3 years, that must have been just when the AI revolution kind of kicked off. So what have you seen? What would you say were some of the most significant changes in the past 3 years since you joined?
I joined in the early part of 23. ChatGPT appeared on the scene November of 22. So that was interesting timing. Yeah. I mean, look, what we've been doing over the last 3 years is really, narrowing our focus. So I'm a strong believer in, do fewer things better. So we've narrowed the focus. We have, and to a few areas where we think we can be successful. We have been organizing the business around our clients. And so client focus or client centricity has been a very big theme. And then driving specialization in sort of within those client orientations, domain expertise, technology, value propositions. That's been the second focus. And so that's what we've been doing. The other thing I would say is we have very materially increased our investment in technology, not just software development, but, AI and data engineering and so on. So we have been on a pathway of becoming a lot more technology enabled.
Somewhere I read that you said that most of your clients, kind of the revenue now sit outside of the traditional localization functions. Tell me more about this. Like, how should we think about it? What client segments are you mostly focusing on?
Yeah, so as we've been orienting the business around clients, and there are sort of 5 sort of segments that we're focused on. Let me just go through them real quick with you. We're focused, as we have traditionally have, on the localization department. Okay, so localization department of large enterprises. We have a second part of the business which is focused on, life sciences companies, so pharma, research organizations, CROs, and and medical devices manufacturers, primarily regulated content flows, right, in the drug development process. Third, we have a part of our business, Park IP, which is focused on legal departments and law firms, primarily the intellectual property and foreign filing. We have another part of our business which is probably best described as a multilingual marketing agency. They do multilingual SEO, performance linguistics, and that sort of thing. They do paid media even. They are focused principally on the marketing teams of large organizations. And then we have Welo Data, the last part, which is really AI training data. They're focused on foundation model builders and labs. And so as we've kind of oriented the business around these 5 areas, what we found is over time that the majority of our revenue, 2/3 of our revenue, in fact, does not come or no longer comes from the localization department. So these buyers are content owners. They could be patent attorneys or clinical research managers or human data training teams in the foundation model builders. And so the texture of our business is quite different today than it was, I would imagine, a decade ago.
So arguably, We Localize was one of the first true LSIs, like in the sense that we describe it, right? The language solution integrators. Because I remember that when I spoke to Smith, maybe 4 or 5 years ago in a podcast, he also outlined how We Localize is tech agnostic, essentially integrating all of the tech. He described it as best of breed. Is that still the case? Is that still your tech approach?
Well, that's good research on your part, pulling up a conversation with Smith 5 or 6 years ago. We have traditionally been technology agnostic, and the origins of that was that we're not a TMS, right? As many of the larger providers also have TMS platforms. We're not a TMS provider, so we have been historically technology agnostic. We work with practically all of the TMS systems in service of various clients. And when it comes to TMSs, we're still not a TMS provider, so we are tech agnostic when it comes to working on various TMS platforms. However, I would say the landscape is obviously, the technology landscape is obviously changing, and we have a strong belief that the agentic layer is going to play a really prominent role in the tech stack in the future. And traditionally it's been cat tools, and you could say machine translation engines. We might get into this in a moment, but what we've seen is that agentic systems just do a much better job at processing multilingual content. And so we think that's a really important layer. And we have also found that unlike, developing SaaS platforms or, traditional software, getting agentic systems right really requires, the domain expertise of a practitioner, obviously combined with, data science and technology capabilities. But, when it comes to agentic systems, we are kind of all in. We are not agnostic when it comes to that. This is our Opal system, which we can, talk about, but that's something we've developed and we're really committed to. So when it comes to TMS platforms, yes, we're absolutely agnostic. When it comes to, agentic systems that we think are really important as part of the multilingual workflow, we are not tech agnostic. When it comes to some of the areas outside of the traditional loc function, where a TMS is not fit for purpose, we've developed a sort of a front end for marketing teams, for instance, and for legal teams. We're not. Those are what we call our studios. We're not tech agnostic for that as well. So I think as the landscape has changed, our posture has changed, with respect to technology and what we really want to own and what we, don't want to own.
Has the past year of AI progress made this harder or easier for you, or just committing to what you're doing in-house, how you do it in-house?
It was pretty clear, in that late 2022 ChatGPT moment that AI was going to play a prominent role. And, obviously innovation has been incredibly rapid, right, in terms of capability. So we started investing heavily in the latter part of 2023. And so we've been we had a hunch that AI in some form, agents, were going to be important. So we've been investing heavily and in the build process for the last 2 years. We've been, in production in earnest in the last about 12 months with Opal and working out the kinks and what are the boundaries of capability and how does it work in different languages and how does it operate at scale. And so we're, that's been, I would say this has been a 2-year journey, but and in that time, we've been building a lot of capability in terms of data science and machine learning capabilities. And so we've been, we're pretty committed to that.
All right. So when we schedule this podcast, sometimes things happen in between. So now you've just launched or announced Welo Global, and I was trying to unpack it before the podcast, but hear from you. Like, tell us what is Welo Global?
As I mentioned, in the last couple of years, we've been executing a strategy of client focus on the one hand and specialization on the other hand, and organizing the business around client segments. And also, as I mentioned, today, 2/3 of our business does not come from the localization department. It comes from outside the localization department. And that's problematic when the word localization is actually embedded in your corporate logo, right? We localize. And the reality is that for folks outside of localization, the term of the loc department, localization doesn't mean that much. So what we're doing is we felt that we needed to kind of catch our branding up with our strategy and the realities of our business today. So we're adopting Welo Global as our new corporate logo. So it's replacing We Localize. And Welo Global, think of that as an umbrella that sits above 5 kind of client brands that face off against very specific client segments. They're solving specific problems. They're building specialized solutions. And that's We Localize against the localization department, Adapt, our marketing agency, Welo Life Sciences, which is a new brand we're also launching this week, which is a brand uniquely facing off against pharmaceutical companies and contract research organizations and medical device manufacturers. Park IP, which is our legal brand, and Welo Data, which is focused on foundation model builders and labs. And so think of Welo Global as an umbrella, right? It has a connective tissue, which is our culture and our sort of core capabilities in multilingual generally. But our client brands are really the brands that are facing off against the market. And so each of those brands is overseen by a general manager. They have their own client, dedicated client delivery or operations teams, go-to-market, marketing, product and technology teams, all focused on solving that client segment's problems. The brand evolution really it's evolving our branding to be more reflective of our business today and our strategy and where we're headed.
Yeah, sounds really familiar because we just did that a day ago. For those who have checked out our website, so we didn't change the name, but we changed everything else. So what was the thinking behind keeping the Park IP and the Adapt and not renaming it as Welo, Adapt or Welo IP? Like, I'm sure you had a lot of discussions around that. Was the brand name too strong? Was it something you didn't want to give up on?
As we were going through the thought process, we knew that We Localize no longer served us from a corporate standpoint. But in terms of what came below, we did a lot of work. We did a lot of surveying of clients out in the market. We did a lot of SEO analysis, like who types what into a Google search bar and what are they looking for. And it turns out the Park IP brand is one of our strongest performing brands.
Wow.
And you may know Park IP, we acquired Park IP right, a decade ago, right? And we've been playing around with, is it, Welo Legal or Park IP, We Localize, and we decided, the brand awareness is so strong, the team decided we're just going to go back to Park IP and not, and that's our client-facing brand. So we stuck with it.
Got it. Adapt, similar story or?
Adapt, similar story, yeah. Adapt is, yeah. So Adapt, again, had really strong market awareness among marketing teams. And so we stuck with Adapt.
Welo Life Sciences, that's an interesting one. So this is, again, it's one of the 5 sub brands. So tell me a bit more about generally working in regulated industries, like what are some of the tailwinds, headwinds there? How is AI and language AI perceived in life sciences? You know, very high cost of failure, obviously, and you know, people are probably a little more cautious to embrace. But no, it's been 3 years, so I'm sure it's happening there as well.
It depends which workflow. So when it comes to, a lot of our business in that segment is in the confines of a clinical trial, right? Really in the core of the drug development process. There where the workflows are regulated, the translated the patient feedback and so on drugs has a very regulated process around it. That content goes to regulators in local jurisdictions. And if there are errors or there's sloppiness around that process, it causes real problems reputationally for the sponsor, for the pharma company. And second of all, it can slow down, the more you start to get iteration loops in that process, it can slow down the clinical trial. And a clinical trial is an incredibly expensive process. And the more you slow it down, the more you reduce the time at which a drug is going to be on patent. So it's a big deal. I mean, each day is worth millions of dollars to a pharma company. And so that is by far the most important component of the value proposition. It's not about cost. To a clinical case manager, the cost of translation is kind of a rounding error in the budget of a clinical trial. What really upsets a clinical case manager is if there are, escalations with a regulatory body in a far-flung geography, or it starts to slow the clinical trial down. So, I would say the embracing of AI is tentative and much less around cost and more around how do you ensure absolute consistency of precision and quality, so you don't bump up against kind of slowing things down or leading to escalations.
And there you work mostly with the CROs or also sometimes directly with the sponsors if they run the study?
Yeah, both CROs, because obviously there's a very large part of the drug development market that is outsourced to contract research organizations. But by the same token, there are also sponsors, right, pharma companies who manage the clinical trials themselves. So we work with both.
You also spoke about Welo Data, your AI training data business. I think you've been involved in this for quite some time. And we just published a big flagship report on it, 160 pages, Data for AI report. I hope you have had a chance to see it. If you don't, you should. So we see it as a key growth area for LSIs. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, how do you see the business perform?
I'm really glad you covered. I have read the report, 160 pages. And I'm really glad that you covered it because it is a natural adjacency to language services, and frankly, that space it doesn't get much coverage by anyone. So I thought that was a really good report. Look, I think we had been involved in some capacity for a number of years in AI training data, but we were managing it as a bit of a side project, right? And it was bumping along. When we went through our review of the business in early part of 2023, we are really excited about the space, right? It's very dynamic, it's growing, and it's sort of a core part of the infrastructure of the AI, the AI revolution. So that was the part of the business we kind of separated out and gave more autonomy to first, and that was in the back end of 2023. What I can tell you is that it is a growth opportunity for LSIs, but it is a very different business. I mean, when you really kind of get into the actual operating model and the technology requirements, it is quite different. The workflows are different than traditional localization. The talent pools are different. What the talent's doing is different. The buyers are different. What they're buying is different. The other thing I would say is that because it's kind of under the umbrella of all things AI, it's a very competitive space, and it's getting more competitive all the time. So you have this sort of Silicon Valley natives like Scale AI and Surge and Turing and so on. But then there's recruitment platforms who have entered the space like Mercor and Handshake. There's kind of companies with vast gig worker networks like Uber and DoorDash, traditional BPOs and systems integration companies like TELUS and TaskUs. So it is a very busy space. It's part of the reason why with separating the business out, Welo Data, our team there today it looks nothing like it did a couple of years ago. We have a very talented general manager, Siobhan Hanna, whom I think you may have met. She ran Lionbridge AI prior to its acquisition by TELUS and ran the data business at TELUS for 3 or 4 years. But most of that team are kind of X-Scale, Invisible, Appen, or from the buy side, right? That the human data, teams at Google, Meta, and Amazon. So I think there's a fair amount of building for an LSI to be successful. I think they probably have less than 50% of what they need. So there's a fair amount of sort of tailoring and building that needs to happen to be really successful in the sort of training data space.
So they don't really have a structural advantage. I mean, they do have maybe, you said 50%, right? So a bit, but then they need to make a very conscious decision to go after this market.
I think it would be tough to call it a structural advantage. I think they've got a head start specifically around multilingual data sets. So look, the Silicon Valley natives, right, Scale and Surge and Mercor and TELUS, or TELUS Digital to an extent, they have not built out, right, full multilingual data capabilities because it's hard. And LSIs have been doing that for a long time, and it's not easy to do that. So that is where I would say LSIs have a head start. But even then, there's a fair amount of adaptation that needs to go on. Like I said, the talent profiles are different. The evaluation, how you evaluate workers is quite different because they're doing a different job. And what we found is just even the volume of applicants in the sourcing funnel is kind of an order of magnitude greater. So there's a fair amount of kind of adaptation that needs to go on, even with a starting point that's a step ahead of the kind of the other players, the Silicon Valley natives.
Maybe just one more follow up on that. Like, is there still a lot of kind of startup activity, or some of these? I mean, Scale has been around for a while, right?
Yeah, Scale kind of you could say founded the space. Probably not founded the space, but was early. There's still a bunch of startup activity. It's incredible. I mean, there are startups all the time that they tend to be people out of that Silicon Valley ecosystem. That maybe they're coming out of one of the sort of foundation model builder labs, and they think they can do something better and have a better value proposition. So yeah, it's pretty busy in terms of startup activity, as well as other companies in adjacencies who are also, trying to enter and build those capabilities as well.
But the secular need for that type of data among the hyperscalers, the frontier labs, that's here to stay, right? Because I've spoken to people who said, maybe we're kind of doing another round here a couple of years, and then I don't know, you're all gonna, like, everyone's just gonna use synthetic data, but I guess there's going to be new ways of needing these companies and these capabilities?
We think it's there to stay. It's certainly not stopping growing. I mean, the demand from the model builders is not slowing down. Now, the nature of the data requirement is different. So I think that, several years ago, it was more general data that was required for training models. It's now there's a lot more specialist data. So, I mean, there's PhDs who are generating data for training models in certain specialties. Multilingual is a really rapidly growing area because, as you would know, the kind of pre-training data set, the kind of common crawl, all of the content on the internet is very oriented toward English. So in the work we've done, but many others have done, the models just behave far less well outside of English, and far less well when it gets to low resource languages. The safety parameters work far less well, right? It's much easier to jailbreak a model in a low resource language than it is in English. So the model builders are, are attentive to this. And so, multilingual is a big deal. Multimodal is a big deal. So visual or auditory data, as people are building the capabilities for chatbots and, agents that work in a customer service environment. Robotics is only just really getting off that requires a massive amount of data. So we don't see the need for human generated data slowing down. Now, there is also synthetic data that's being used in the process, but the entire space is growing both on the synthetic side as well as the human side.
Let's talk a bit about Opal, the system you mentioned, kind of the integration system. So, yeah, tell us more about it. I guess Welo Data is probably not on it. You're not using Opal
No.
for the data business. So that's more the localization side.
It's more the localization side. So basically, Opal is, in very simple terms, it's an agentic system that consists of machine translation, but LLMs to do translation work, right? So the way to think about it is a much better version of a machine translation engine. In fact, it's twice as good. In all of the testing we've done, it delivers content that is twice as good from a quality standpoint, however you choose to measure it. Now, like I said, this has been an area of investment for us for the last couple of years, and we've been in production for 12 months. We've done a lot of testing, a lot of side-by-side comparisons, and it just performs much, much better. And so one of the questions is, well, why does it perform better? And part of it is that in putting an agentic system together, it requires a really robust harness that allows the models to be trained on an enterprise's kind of unique content and style, including language pairs and glossaries and style guides. Secondly, these agents, given their context window, have a much broader context than an empty engine. So they tend to do better on fluency, right? Which is a challenge with empty engines. But third, there's a fair amount of science in constructing this harness that I was mentioning around the algorithms, and that involves RAG, right, and database architectures, how content is actually ingested, and the feedback loops to make the whole system kind of continue learning. So look, that's what Opal is. The final point I would make is that the way we're going to market is we're taking a distinctly open architecture kind of interoperable approach. And so what I mean by that is that we have, well over a dozen We Localize customers, using Opal today, where they're paying for both the technology and the servicing. But we are decoupling Opal from the servicing. So we're very happy if enterprises use Opal but they use their own LSI for servicing. We're very happy for smaller LSIs who can't afford to invest in the kind of AI data science to leverage Opal to be more competitive in the market. It's it's very challenging for smaller LSIs. And this is why, you would have seen the announcement with Phrase, where Phrase clients can now access Opal natively through Phrase's platform. We also have integrated Opal into Blackbird. You will see it shortly on the Anthropic App Store with MCP connections into it, with a lot of distribution arrangements and partnerships to follow. And so there is a fundamental belief here, and frankly, I think we share this belief with Phrase and Blackbird, and that is that given AI, I think you can expect the technology landscape to be kind of messy in the coming years, and as enterprises work out how to adopt agentic and rearrange their technology stacks. We think that having a kind of an open architecture approach, an interoperable approach, where is really about giving clients choice, for wherever they are on their journeys, is the right approach. So we're taking a very, a kind of a distinctly different approach, I would say, than some of our competitors in terms of how we're going to market with Opal.
Yeah, and I mean, the clients are going to go where they have to go anyway. I mean, you might as well give them the choice and be more open and not try to lock in too much, huh?
Clients get really upset with being locked in. They get upset with a walled garden approach. They don't like it. And frankly, I think what's going on outside of language services, what's going on in technology generally, is more of an open architecture approach. So we think, we think that's the best approach in the coming years.
You've posted a couple of interesting LinkedIn posts that I want to touch on now.
My gosh.
They got a few views, likes, comments. So let me start with the first one, where you touched on ROI and localization and the industry. So I think I'm going to just read the first paragraph and then I'll let you explain.
Yeah.
So you say, I know as an industry, and I'm quoting you now, we are desperate to draw a straighter line between localization spend and business outcomes. However, I would argue that trying to construct an ROI justifying localization spend as quote unquote accelerating international growth is close to futile. So yeah, this, localization ROI equation, that stirred up some comment. Tell us more. What are your thoughts there?
The qualifier of close to futile, close to is doing a lot of work there. So it's not entirely futile. My background has been spent in consulting and in general management, has been spent a lot doing sort of making financial justifications for investments or initiatives or programs. And I've spent quite a lot of time on the other side of the table, whether it's, in the CEO capacity or in a board capacity, of being pitched, right, justifications for investment. So I'm pretty in touch with what robust ROI, financial justifications look like. Now, I honestly, just because of the diversity of use cases within language services, I actually think the ROI for localization spend is really complicated. And so you could take one case, let's say an extreme case with a pure, digital provider, right? Digital data provider, could be YouTube, something like that, and you translate the content or dub the content, and then users might be attracted to that, right? In a foreign market, there's very little other incremental spend in expanding internationally. You could draw perhaps a reasonably straight line between, well, I spent this on localization and this is the outcome in new users or whatever. But then most businesses are not like that. My last business, which was a data business, which had a licensing model, so basically investors would have a seat license to access content, and we could translate all of our content for a new market, but that wouldn't amount to anything without having salespeople on the ground to go and sell those licenses, marketing involved to create brand awareness. It could be that we got to create, new types of content that appeal to the specific customers in that market. And so, localization is kind of a part of a set of investments that are required to really capture that international expansion. And it's even more complex for a product company where, yes, you have sales or marketing, but you've got to establish distribution relationships. Maybe you've got to manufacture in that new market. And so, I think the whole ROI thing and the fact that localization is generally 9 times out of 10 a piece of a broader set of investments make the whole thing complicated. And to be honest, the ROIs that I've seen, or the ROIs that I've seen from localization managers are just way too simplistic. All right, it's like, well, you spend this on localization and you capture this upside in international expansion, and it's missing all the other stuff, right? And so my personal view is that, look, localization managers have a hard enough time, getting a seat at the table and being, influential when it comes to decision making. Putting forward a simplistic and unsophisticated ROI for localization spend, I don't think helps. In fact, I think it damages credibility. So I think the choice is you either partner really closely with the other teams who are involved in the international expansion, could be the marketing team or the product team, right? And you put together a comprehensive picture, right, of what the ROI is. In that context, I think most people would say, localization is a really important component, but it's a component. But I think to try to sort of draw a circle around localization and a straight line to a set of outcomes, I just think risks undermining credibility, because it misses the kind of the comprehensive picture of how investment and return really work.
Well said. Well said. Yeah. Not everything is adding another language on Netflix and having somebody dub it. It's pretty. Yeah. It's the best example where it's like there is a straight line, but yeah, everything's kind of downstream complexity from that, or more.
It really
complex
is.
than
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, second post. Let me just read the first one. That very interesting. So the second one was a little early, a couple of weeks ago. You said, I do wonder whether the dialogue in language services gets tangled between the notion of an industry versus a profession. And I'll let you explain the rest.
I'm an outsider, right? I've only been working in language services for the last 3 years. And one of the things that's been clear is that language services is quite an unusual industry, right? Most B2B industries kind of coalesce around a buyer or a single, a very small handful of buyers, and solving a singular problem, right? So if you think about cloud computing is a $900 billion industry, okay? It sells to the technology department, and it solves the problem of flexibility and scalability of technology infrastructure, right? That's that industry. And, HR, BPO is another example, right? That's a $300 to $400 billion industry. It sells to the HR department, and it's solving the problem of delivering, world-class, highly effective HR services. It's tough to say that for language services. Language services sells to loads of different departments and buyers, from, certainly local departments, but clinical teams and hospital administrators and government departments and product leaders and HR teams. I mean, it sells to all sorts of different departments, and it's solving as many problems as there are departments and use cases, right? It's hard to say the singular problem that language services solves, right? Business problem. So if you say, well, what is the connective tissue that binds the industry together? It doesn't seem to be kind of uniformity of buyers, right? And it doesn't seem to be, well, the industry is collectively solving this business problem. And then you say, well, actually, what really binds the industry together is multilingual capability, and that's linguists. And linguists are a profession who are concerned with professional standards and certifications. And so, you sort of step back, and there's kind of a loose industry kind of logic around business problem solving and buyers, but there's a very strong connective tissue around the linguists, which just raises this interesting question of, well, is language services really a profession, or is it an industry? And so, look, it's not. I don't know whether there's any practical implications to one way or the other. It's kind of an interesting academic question, but that was the purpose of the LinkedIn post.
100%. I mean, I agree with the just the diversity of clients, buyers, use cases, problems you're solving, things you're doing. This is what makes it extremely challenging also to run an LSI as large as yours, because you need so many different people, so many different salespeople with different capabilities, like somebody who understands how to sell to a CRO and like a clinical manager or regulatory manager doesn't really know how to sell to a cloud computing company and their latest marketing campaign, etc. So very different. Which brings me to one of my last questions. Like, how do you manage the kind of upskilling of your workforce in an environment that's so fast moving, right? I mean, like I've heard MCP the first time like 2 weeks ago, and now I'm supposed to have like a kind of an educated conversation about it. And I'm just having conversations about it. You guys need to actually work on this stuff and implement it. So how do you do that in an organization as large as yours?
This is part of the reason why we've, been over the last couple of years separating the business out around very distinct areas, right? And so, you're right that the commercial person who can sell and have a conversation with a clinical case manager is not the same person who goes and sells to a patent attorney, right, or to a marketing manager. And so, the profiles, right, so specialization is kind of, is really evolving into very different recruiting profiles for those teams, right? As I mentioned, our Welo data business, all of those people are coming out of the data, right? They're coming out of the foundation model builders or the training data business. Look, so I think there's a natural kind of orientation in that regard. But I think that the one of the things that we have been really focused on is certainly there's the aspect of skill, okay, and people who understand MCPs and data scientists and whatnot, okay. But the thing that we've been really focused on most recently is mindset, okay. And so in a situation which is more stable, let's say, the risk of changing something tends to outweigh the risk of maintaining the status quo. And so there's an organizational behavioral orientation around maintaining the status quo, right? Not breaking things, not changing things very much. But given the level of disruption that's going on, right, and reinvention, the equation flips. So the risk of preserving the status quo at this point, we think outweighs the risk of changing, right? And that is not a sort of a skill set as such. That is more of a mindset. And so that takes courage and innovation, questioning everything from first principles, and really not being afraid to break stuff that no longer works or serves us. And so what we have sort of feathered into our performance management processes, and that we look for explicitly when it comes to recruiting, is those sorts of people, right? That we need to operate as a large startup, because the rate of reinvention and adaptation is such that we won't keep pace, right? If we don't have that element to our culture. So insofar as we need new skills because there are new capabilities we need to build and so on, there's that side. But what we've been focused on quite a bit recently is how do we tilt our culture to be embracing the right mindset that is adapting and changing at a rate at which we think that the environment demands.
Speaking of the environment, closing question: what's your kind of general business outlook for 2026 and for Welo Global specifically? Where do you see major risks and where do you see opportunities given? It's a crazy market out there right now on many fronts.
Yeah, it's a crazy market for sure. I mean, look, we're feeling I would say we're feeling I feel optimistic. We feel optimistic. I mean, we think that the prognostications that the industry's getting decimated are just wildly overblown. That's just not what we're seeing. So we're seeing demand in all sorts of areas. The trouble is that the nature of the demand is changing, right? And I think the companies that are going to struggle are ones that cannot adapt to the changing nature of demand, which require new capabilities. They require products like Opal, right? They require AI-enabled workflows, and so we think that's what the risk. The risk is that we're not developing capabilities and technology at the rate at which demand is evolving, and so hence why we're spending so much time on culture and speed, to kind of rise to the challenge. So look, at an intergalactic level, we're feeling really optimistic. We think we're on the right pathway. We are maniacally focused on, speed of evolution and helping, meeting evolving client demand.
All right. That's the plan for 2026, the intergalactic approach to it. Right, Paul. Paul, thank you so much for taking the time today. This was great. Thank you.
Thank you, Florian. Thanks for having me.